So, you've heard of this game, Magic the Gathering. Maybe you don't know what it is, or maybe you do know and you just don't know how to play. Well, Magic the Gathering is a TCG, which stands for Trading Card Game. And this is a game that has over 30 years of history, with over 1,000 cards to its name. This game has become very complicated and has been compared to chess multiple times. But the goal of this game is actually rather simple. It is to get your opponent's life total from 20 down to 0. Now, the way that a person is able to do this is a very complex answer. This is because, as I've said, there are over 1,000 cards in the game. So, that can be a lot of answers. But to try and simplify this game down a little bit, I'm going to be talking about the 7 types of cards in the game. Not all at once, mainly because there's a lot to explain, but we're going to try and break it down to some of the more common ones, and for this video, we're going to be talking about the most common of common cards you'll see in a game, that being lands and creatures. We're starting off with lands, mainly because these are the resources of the game. Now, Magic doesn't want us to play the most powerful cards right away. They want us to build up resources over time. This is done by having a rule that only one land can be played during each player's turn. So then, how do we use this resource known as lands? Well, what we do is that we tap them, we turn them sideways, also called tapping, in order to generate something called mana. Mana is what we use in order to cast our spells. And there are a wide variety of colors that are associated with them. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Let's focus on the different types of lands, because there are a lot of kinds that people can hear about. Tap lands, dual lands, gain lands. But instead of going over all these lands, because it would take an entire video in order to explain what they are, we're going to focus on the more common ones that people will see, those being shock lands, fetch lands, man lands, and basic lands. We're going to start off with basic lands, mainly because these are the most common types of lands. I mean, almost every single pack of Magic comes with a basic land inside. Now we can tell it's a basic land, just like how we could tell all types of cards by looking in between the art and the text box. Right here it says basic land. And then if you see the dash, we see a subtype. And this one is plains. Now, there are 5 basic land types, and each of them is associated with the 5 colors of Magic. These being plains, which can tap for white mana, islands that can be tapped for blue mana, swamps that can be tapped for black mana, mountains which tap for red mana, and forests that tap for green mana. These are the 5 basic lands, and these are the 5 colors of Magic. That means that spells that are cast in Magic are usually associated with one or even more of these colors. For the next 2 kinds of lands, I've decided to put them together because of a very important interaction that occurs between the 2 of them. These 2 lands are shock lands and fetch lands. Shock lands are lands that can produce one of 2 kinds of colored mana. A person can tell because they have two basic land types. And they get their name because they can come into play untap, means that you could use them right away, but you have to pay a price of 2 life. Now, this is associated with their name because there's a card called Shock in Magic, which deals 2 damage to any target. So, when you bring this card into play and you do 2 damage to yourself, it's as though you're casting Shock on yourself, hence their name. And then, next, we have our fetch lands. Fetch lands cannot produce any mana. However, what they can do is to be able to search in our library for certain kinds of lands. The kind that we have, Marsh Flats, can be used to search for a plains or a swamp. Okay, so back to that interaction I was talking about earlier. I'm going to show you how this works. So first, we have our Marsh Flats. Its ability is that we tap it and we pay 1 life in order to look in our library for a plains or a swamp. So let's do that. Tap it, sack it, and then we get a Hallowed Fountain into play and we shock ourselves for 2. This is very important for 2 reasons. 1, deck thinning. And if you have a bunch of land cards in your deck, while mana is good, having spells in order to interact is even better. So by thinning your deck of cards that are okay into cards that are great, that makes it much easier to win the game. The second reason, mana fixing, is something that I can actually show you. So, let's go to our next part. This here is a spell, a creature spell to be exact. And if we look on the top right, there is a mana symbol on it. This Lunarch Veteran, this creature spell, needs 1 white mana in order to be cast. Now let's take a look at an opening hand. If you notice, there are 2 spells that are blue, 1 spell that is white, 2 lands that produce black mana, 1 land that produces colorless mana, and a Marsh Flats. Remember the interaction that we played earlier, because if we didn't have that Marsh Flats, we wouldn't be able to cast any of the spells in our hands. But because we do have Marsh Flats, we can set it onto the battlefield, tap it, sacrifice it, and then go looking for that Hallowed Fountain. That means that once we have enough mana, we'd be able to cast all the spells in our hands once we have enough lands or mana sources to do so. And for Lunarch Veteran, that means that it comes into play right away. We're moving on to manlands. In order to understand why manlands are actually very powerful, we're not actually going to be talking about manlands. Instead, we'll be talking about creatures, mainly because manlands are given their name because they turn into creatures. So, what are creatures? These are a certain type of spell that are in the game. Now, notice how Colossal Dreadmaw has 3 mana symbols on the top right corner, unlike Lunarch Veteran, which only had 1. What this means for Colossal Dreadmaw is that the 2 green represent that you need to be able to produce 2 green mana and 4 mana of any color. That type of mana could be like red, white, colorless, or even more green mana. If we look on the bottom, we'll notice that there are 2 numbers that are separated with a slash. The one on the left is called its power. This is how much damage this creature can deal. And then if you look on its right, this is its toughness. This is how much damage it can take before it dies. To show mainly why power is so good, remember at the beginning when I said an opponent's life starts at 20. Well, what happens is that during one phase in your turn, your creature has a chance, just one chance, to be tapped, much like a land. In doing this, it deals its power to your opponent's life total, taking that 20 down to a 14. That's a pretty huge chunk of damage. But that's only if your creature doesn't have anything getting in its way. Oh, right. If your creature just came onto the battlefield, then your creature cannot attack. This is because it has something in Magic, we call it summoning sickness. That means they feel queasy, and so they can attack right away. So, going back to what if your opponent has creatures on the battlefield. So, if we see here, there are 6 creatures with 1 power each and 1 toughness each. With 6 power and 6 toughness, it's as though they had a Colossal Dreadmaw. Let's say it's the phase where you can attack. Colossal Dreadmaw swings in. When this occurs, your opponent has the opportunity to declare blockers. That means they can choose any number of their creatures to block with. Let's say your opponent decides to block with all their creatures. So, your Colossal Dreadmaw, as I said before, has 6 power. That means it deals 6 damage to each of your opponent's creatures. They all die, because that is how much toughness they had in total. But remember, they each had 1 power, and there were 6 of them. That means they deal 6 damage to Colossal Dreadmaw. So what happens here is your Colossal Dreadmaw dies, and your opponent's life total remains at 20. But let's say your opponent doesn't have all those creatures. Let's say they only have 3. Well, when you go to attack, let's say your opponent again chooses to block with all their creatures. What happens is your opponent's creatures die, they soak up 3 damage, and they get dealt the excess 3 damage. But this is only because Colossal Dreadmaw has an ability called Trample. This means that excess damage actually gets transferred over to your opponent. What happens then if you don't have Trample? Let's take Cleanup Crew. Costs the same amount of mana, same power, same toughness, and your opponent again still has 3 creatures. So we go to combat, go to attack, and as I said, your opponent can choose any number of creatures that they would wish to block with. So they choose 1. Because Cleanup Crew does not have Trample, that means that damage in excess does not get transferred over to your opponent. Your opponent's creature dies, your Cleanup Crew is still exhausted, but your opponent still has 2 creatures and their life total does not change at all. That means that during their turn, they can also choose to attack, or continuously choosing to block with 1 creature in order to stop damage from going through. In Magic, we call this chump blocking. As I said in the beginning, Magic is a complex game with many different types of creatures. And while they can attack, it doesn't mean that is their only purpose. Maybe you want to gain life when creatures come into play. Maybe you want creatures to draw you cards to help you find your ways to win the game. Maybe you want creatures that can destroy other creatures when they come into play. Maybe you want creatures that can attack the very moment that they're put into play. Or maybe you just want to go trampling through to smush all your opponent's puny creatures. Magic doesn't have to be complicated. You could just have a game where you have your 7 cards, 20 life, and just 2 phases. One where you just play lands and creatures, and in the next one, you just attack and pass. And you could just keep going like this if you want. This technically isn't how Magic is played, but it's also not how the game is played. But also remember that this is a game, so the main goal of it is just to have fun. And if you're having fun, then why need to stop it? Anyway, that's it for now. Hopefully you guys get to play some games, and be well, play well.